Hey guys, tonight we're setting out on a little time travel journey together. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a city that I sent tea, quite the bustling metropolis of today, but something older, dustier, and much more fragile. The walls are thick but chipped, the streets narrow and uneven, and the air carries that faint, comforting scent of wood smoke mixed with livestock. We're going to see how some of the very first cities in human history prepared themselves for bedtime. And let me warn you up front, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's dangerous, but because your eyelids will get so heavy that you'll be drifting into sleep before the gates even close. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there, because I love seeing how our little nighttime caravan stretches across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun is slipping low, and with it the pulse of the city begins to shift. In places like Uruk or Mohenjo-daro, or even early Thebes, the walls that defined the edge of the world were more than just stone or mud brick. They were promises that what lay outside was dangerous, but what remained inside could be ordered, protected, and lulled into rest. As twilight falls, the massive city gates, usually made of heavy cedar planks or layered timbers bound with bronze studs, begin to creak. Imagine the sound, a slow groan, like an old ship tightening against its ropes. The guards, sunburned and tired from a long day of squinting at the horizon, shift their weight as they lean into the work. The bolts slide into place, thick as your forearm, slamming home with a finality that makes everyone on the inside feel just a bit safer. This ritual of closing the gates was not just practical, but symbolic. In Mesopotamian cities, gates were often decorated with carved lions, protective demons, or even entire shrines built right into the entryways. To walk through a city gate was to pass under the gaze of gods. And at night, when those gates shut, it wasn't only about keeping enemies out. It was about sealing the spiritual and economic life of the city until morning. Historians still argue whether the gates were closed at a strict time each evening, marked perhaps by a horn or drum, or whether it was looser, decided by the judgment of the watch commander depending on light and threat. Picture the crowd outside the gate, too late to be admitted. Merchants trudging home along the dusty road, travelers urging their donkeys forward in a last dash to reach the safety of the city before the doors slammed shut. Some would make it through at the final moment, breathless, muttering thanks to whatever god they carried on a necklace. Others would be forced to camp just outside the walls, exposed to thieves, jackals, or worse, mosquitoes. It's hard to say which danger people feared more. Inside, the mood was calmer, but charged with its own urgency. The gatekeepers would check their lists, a clay tablet tucked under the arm of the officer in charge. Early receipts, if you will names, taxes, obligations, even rations. These weren't just dusty bureaucratic details. They were part of the rhythm of the city's survival. And if you didn't make the list, well, you probably weren't sleeping behind walls that night. You might recall how the Sumerians loved their clay tablet yard, high woe receipts, jo hum nunk cows, or barley k, lie bannet deck the same system extended here to the question of who could enter, who could leave, and who got locked out. As the doors creaked shut, guards stationed themselves in towers above. Some would light torches, the smoke curling upward and staining the twilight. Others would lean casually on their spears, watching shadows lengthen beyond the walls. The first cities didn't have electricity, of course, but they had vigilance. Every watchman knew his route, knew the sound of his staff clanging against the stones as he walked, and knew how to shout the signal if anything stirred in the darkness beyond. There's a quirky tidbit from Babylonian records. They sometimes trained dogs to act as early motion detectors. Not the friendly house dogs we imagine, but lean, sharp-eared beasts chained near the gates. Their barks carried far, echoing against clay walls, startling sleepers awake if something moved outside. In a way, these dogs were just as much part of the city's security system as the guards. Imagine trying to drift off to sleep with that chorus of barking carrying through the streets. Perhaps that's why people clung to charms and lullabies, because silence at night was never guaranteed, and the symbolism of closing those gates carried deep psychological weight. With the world outside shut away, families inside the walls felt cocooned. The city became a kind of giant communal bedroom. The streets emptied, the torches along the walls flickered, and the walls themselves became a cradle. The first cities may have been noisy during the day, but at night they tried to be something else, womb-like, protective and sleepy. Some scholars argue that the very act of closing gates influenced how ancient people thought of time. The day wasn't simply when the sun rose and set, was when the gates opened and closed. The gate was the clock, the hinge on which the city's sense of safety turned. And though they couldn't know it, this daily rhythm would echo down to us in countless ways. After all, even today, in many languages, words for safety, closure, or household protection trace back to terms for gates and doors. Yet, closing a gate didn't guarantee peace. There are tablets that whisper of betrayals, night attacks when someone bribed a gatekeeper, or thieves slipping through drainage tunnels. This paranoia made the nightly ritual all the more serious. Too close a gate was to declare, "We are safe." But everyone knew safety was fragile, as thin as the oil lamps flickering in the guard towers. Still, the people believed. The sound of the gates slamming shut became a lullaby of its own, a reassurance, a final punctuation on the day. And in that moment, as the dust settled, the first cities could finally exhale. The gates are sealed now, heavy beams pressed tight against the doors, and what follows is a gradual emptying of the city's pulse. If the gates were the heartbeat, then the marketplace was its breath. And when the last of the day's bargaining fades away, the whole place begins to feel like a chest settling after a long sigh. You can almost picture itros of woven mats and wooden counters stacked with dried fish, figs, and copper trinkets. All day long the air had been buzzing with voices, merchants shouting over each other, neighbors haggling with suspiciously exaggerated groans, children darting between stalls with sticky fingers clutching dates they probably hadn't paid for. By the time the sky softens to a bruised purple, though, the stalls begin to close up one by one, the clatter of scales being packed away, the flap of woven awnings rolled down, the scratchy sound of baskets being dragged across cobblestones. These are the noises of a city putting itself to bed. In your archaeologists have found remnants of clay tokens and sealed envelopes near market spaces, hints that even ordinary trades were meticulously recorded. So yes, when a potter sold you a jug, he might actually press a seal into wet clay to confirm the deal, even if it was the last purchase of the evening. Historians still argue whether this habit was driven by trust issues or by an almost compulsive love of paperwork. Either way, the result was the same. You could close a stall but still carry the day's records like a lullaby carved in clay. As the market dwindles, there's a sharp sensory change. The spices, cumin, coriander, garlic start fading into the background, replaced by the musty smell of dust settling. The air grows cooler without the crush of bodies, packed shoulder to shoulder, and the noise, the noise dies beautifully. Instead of arguments over the price of barley, you begin to hear quieter sounds, the scrape of a broom brushing away discarded chaff, the grunt of a shopkeeper stacking jars against the wall, the last echo of coins dropped into a cloth pouch. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some markets didn't tee really close in the way we think of it. There are records from thieves suggesting that night markets occasionally cropped up near temple courtyards, fueled by festivals or moonlit rituals. So while most of the city was shushing itself to sleep, you might still find one corner glowing with oil lamps, selling wine or roasted chickpeas to night wanderers. Imagine stumbling upon that half the city snoring in darkness, one square still buzzing like a secret party. For the majority, though, silence was law. Markets that stayed open to late risked fines, especially in cities that prided themselves on order. The idea was simple. Noise after dusk wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Too much chatter could mask the sound of a thief's footsteps, or a fire catching somewhere down the street. So families learned to wrap their goods carefully, store jars of beer under mats, and close shutters with deliberate finality. One of the most human details in all this leftovers. Picture a bread seller gathering up flatbreads that hadn't sold, tucking them into a cloth to take home for dinner. Brewer checking the day's last jug of frothy beer, pouring himself a sip before sealing it for tomorrow. A candlemaker scraping wax drips into a lump, knowing he'd remelt it the next day. The city might look asleep, but within every stall lingered the residue of daytime effort, the crumbs, the smells, the scraps that reminded everyone life would resume tomorrow. Historians still debate how regulated these nightly closures were. Some argue that officials made rounds, ensuring no one lingered in the squares. Others think it was far more organic, a social rhythm that simply happened when torches dimmed and families grew weary. Perhaps both are true. After all, human beings crave routine, and nothing is more routine than knowing when to pack up shop and call it a night. And so the market empties. The last donkey cart rattles away. The dust settles where once there had been shouting, and the air feels suddenly spacious. The stone pavements, still warm from the day's sun, give off a faint heat under bare feet. If you were walking there, you'd feel the hush physically, the way sound carries in an emptier space. It's the ancient version of the moment a restaurant turns off its music and starts sweeping the floors. Subtle reminder that it's time to leave, to go home, to rest. For the first cities, the marketplace was never just commerce. It was the living theater of their days. And each evening, when the curtains closed, the city tucked away its performance with the same quiet reverence we give our bedrooms. The square that had been a chorus of bargaining just hours before became a silent courtyard of stone, waiting under the stars. As the markets fall silent, the rhythm of the city shifts inward. What had been noise and movement during the day is replaced with the glow of fires and lamps, small islands of light scattered through streets and courtyards. For people in the first cities, the setting sun was not the end of activity, but it did signal a change of pace. This was the time when families retreated to their homes, when fires were carefully tended, and when the balance between light and dark became a delicate negotiation. Imagine a row of clay houses pressed close together, their walls rough to the touch, built with sun-baked bricks that held the day's heat long after sunset. Inside, the hearth glowed faintly. Fires weren't allowed to burn unchecked. Wood and charcoal were too precious for that. So families learned the art of coaxing flames down into embers, a careful management of warmth and safety. You might see someone crouching with a stick, gently spreading the coals so they glimmered evenly. It wasn't just practical, it was a kind of nightly ritual, a way of saying to the fire, "Rest now, but be ready to wake again." For light oil lamps were the trusted companions of night, simple bowls of clay, their rims pinched to hold a wick made of twisted plant fiber. Olive oil in the Mediterranean, sesame oil in Mesopotamia, even fish oil in some coastal regions, each one with its own smell, its own weight in the air. You can almost smell the faint sharpness of burning oil, the kind that clings to your hair and fabric after a few hours. These lamps were small, but they were steady, and their glow created little pools of golden calm in otherwise shadowed rooms. Historians still argue whether lamps were used generously or sparingly. Oil was expensive, after all. Some believe that only the wealthy could afford to keep lamps burning through the night, while poorer families relied on moonlight through small windows or the lingering embers of a hearth. Archaeological digs, however, show lamps scattered in almost every kind of dwelling, suggesting that even ordinary households had at least one small flame to light their evenings. Perhaps people were more resourceful than we imagine, stretching a few drops of oil to last as long as possible. One quirky detail survives from Babylon. There are records of public fires maintained at crossroads, tended by watchmen. These fires weren't just for light, they acted as landmarks, a way for people navigating the dark streets to orient themselves. Without them, getting lost in a maze-like city after sunset would have been dangerously easy. Picture it: a traveler making their way home after a late temple ritual. The streets pitch black except for the occasional glow of a public fire ahead, like a beacon. In a city where alleys twisted like veins and every corner looked the same at night, these flames were the equivalent of streetlights. And yet, fire was always a double-edged friend. The same glow that comforted also threatened. A single ember landing in the wrong place, on a thatched roof, in a pile of straw, near a wooden beam could transform the city into chaos. That fear shaped the way people treated flames. Some cities had laws against carrying uncovered torches through certain districts. Others had designated firekeepers, individuals responsible for monitoring public flames and making sure they didn't get out of hand. It's not hard to imagine why. In a crowded city of mud brick and timber, fire was both life and potential destruction. Inside households, lamps created intimacy. Families gathered close around their flickering bowls, sharing bread, cheese, or leftover stew from the day's pot. The shadows lengthened across the walls, flickering with the smallest draft. Children played with those shadows, making shapes with their hands before being told to quiet down. And in that golden half-light, the city began to slow its heartbeat. The noises outside softened, replaced by the steady hum of insects, the occasional bray of a donkey, or the faint call of a watchman in the distance. If you step onto a rooftop, you'd see a patchwork of lights spread unevenly across the city. Some houses glowing bright, others already dark, their families asleep. In wealthier districts, lamps might flicker all night, fueled by larger stores of oil. In poorer quarters, the lamps went out quickly, leaving only the pale wash of moonlight on flat clay roofs. The contrast was sharp: one family wrapped in shadows, another basking in soft light, yet both bound together by the rhythm of night. And while lamps marked safety, they also revealed secrets. Light attracted attention. A flame burning too late into the night might raise suspicions. Was a family secretly brewing beer for sale? Was a scribe working overtime to copy tablets under temple orders? Was someone meeting a lover after everyone else had gone to bed? A lamp in the darkness could tell stories without a single word spoken. There's an account from Thebes describing families extinguishing lamps deliberately before beginning certain bedtime prayers, believing that darkness itself was purer for addressing the gods. And elsewhere in Mesopotamia, some texts suggest lamps were kept burning in corners as protection against restless spirits. It seems no one quite agreed on the right balance between light and dark only, that both were powerful, both needed to be respected. The city then glowed softly in the night, not in the blazing way we imagine modern cities, but like a scattering of fireflies across a sleeping plain. Each lamp, each hearth, was a tiny claim against the vastness of darkness outside the walls, and together they made the city feel alive, even as it rested. The first cities did not vanish into silence when the sun sank. They spluttered, breathing slowly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the stars. With the gates sealed, the markets hushed, and lamps flickering softly. Another nightly ritual unfolded in the first cities, the tending of animals. If you lived in Ur or Mohenjo-daro, or an early Egyptian town along the Nile, the city was not just a cluster of humans. It was also a living barn, humming with the sounds of creatures that had worked, carried, guarded, and fed families all day long. As night settled, these animals, too, needed to be guided into rest. Picture the streets as the sun finally dropped below the horizon. Donkeys trudged home, their sides heaving from carrying jars of beer or sacks of grain. Goats bleated impatiently, tugging against ropes as children pulled them toward pens. Cattle lowed, their deep, throaty voices echoing between mud-brick walls. Chickens scurried in small, nervous bursts, seeking corners where they could roost safely. The city, which had once been a theater of commerce, now shifted into something that felt more like a vast, interconnected stable. Archaeologists digging in the Indus Valley uncovered courtyards designed with troughs and drains. Evidence that animals weren't kept at the fringes, but right within household compounds. Imagine the smells: warm hay, manure, damp earth, and the familiarity of those smells. For city dwellers, animals weren't distant farm stock. They were companions in survival. At night, pens were secured, troughs filled with water one last time, and animals tethered so they wouldn't wander into streets where thieves or hungry dogs might seize them. One quirky practice recorded in Mesopotamian tablets involved temple goats. Certain goats, dedicated to gods, were kept inside sanctuaries at night. They weren't ordinary livestock. They were divine property. To steal from them was to steal directly from a god, which was a far graver crime than snatching a neighbor's chicken. Historians still argue whether these temple herds were purely symbolic, or whether they served practical roles in providing milk and offerings. Either way, their bleating in sacred courtyards added a strange, holy layer to the nighttime chorus. Horses, where they were known, received special treatment. In later cities like those of the Hittites or Assyrians, they were prized beyond measure. Grooms rubbed them down, tied them securely, and sometimes even covered them with woven blankets to keep off the chill. These weren't just beasts of burden. They were engines of power, prestige, and war. To leave a horse untended was unthinkable, like leaving your strongest soldier drunk and asleep at his post. And donkeys poor, overworked donkeys, were the heartbeat of city labor. They carried grain sacks from field to gate, pots of water from well to home, and in some cases, even people. At night, their reward was modest: a feed bag of grains, a scratch behind the ears, a tether to a post where they could finally rest. Their brays, loud and unmistakable, often punctuated the city's night sounds, so much so that some texts mock their endless noise. But to silence them completely would have been eerie, like missing a familiar lullaby. Dogs had a dual role. Many households kept them as guards, tying them at doorways or near pens. Their sharp barks warned of intruders. Yet not all dogs were tame. Stray packs roamed the streets, scavenging for scraps, fighting each other in alleys. To hear the growl of strays outside your door while your own dog barked from within must have been unsettling. A reminder that not all animals belonged to human care. Some cities even had night watchmen trained to chase away these strays, ensuring peace for sleeping households. Cats, though less prominent in Mesopotamia, became essential companions in Egypt. By dusk, Egyptian households carefully coaxed their cats indoors or let them roam deliberately to hunt rodents. A city without cats was vulnerable to mice, gnawing at grain stores. So while some animals were tethered tightly, cats earned the freedom of night, slipping through shadows like guardians of granaries. The nightly stabling wasn't just about safety, it was about order. Ancient cities thrived on rhythm, and animals were part of that rhythm. Their movements synchronized with human activity, driven out to work at dawn, gathered back at dusk, enclosed at night. The sight of animals filing into pens signaled closure just as clearly as the shutting of gates or the dimming of market. And there's another layer to this. Some myths even tied animal rest to cosmic order. In Sumerian hymns, gods were described as shepherds who guided not just people but flocks of sheep into pens at night. Sleep, then, was imagined as a kind of divine shepherding, the cosmos tucking away its creatures, both human and animal, for safekeeping until dawn. It's poetic, isn't it, to think of the bleating goats and lowing cattle as echoes of a greater pattern, a nightly choreography that reassured everyone the world was still in balance. So, as lamps flickered and streets fell quiet, the first cities were never truly silent. The bleats, brays, and barks blended into a strange lullaby. Families tucked into mats inside their homes, but just on the other side of thin walls. Animals shifted, snorted, and breathed heavily. The city's sleep was always shared, always woven with the steady pulse of creatures settling in their pens. And for many, those familiar sounds were as comforting as any prayer. With the gates barred, the markets stilled, and the animals tucked away, the city's attention turned to water. No matter how ancient or advanced, no city could breathe without its wells, cisterns, and sacred fountains. Daytime was a frenzy of hauling and splashing women, balancing jars on their hips, children darting with cups, servants trudging with buckets, heavy enough to bend their backs. But by night, even water had its rituals, and the last buckets were drawn with a kind of reverence. Imagine the scene in a Mesopotamian courtyard as twilight deepened. A family's last chore before laying down their mats was always to fetch water. Clay jars, smooth at the lip from years of use, were lowered into a well with squealing pulleys, or knotted ropes that burned against calloused hands. The splash echoed up from the darkness below, cool and hollow. Children leaned too close, peering into the black, and were scolded sharply. Everyone knew stories of people slipping into wells and vanishing. To close the evening safely, The rope was tied neatly, the jar filled, and a slab or cover placed over the wellhead to keep animals, debris, or wandering spirits out. Historians still argue whether most households had their own cisterns, or whether community wells were the main source. In Mohenjo-Daro, evidence points to both. Many houses had private bathing areas connected to drains, yet there were also public wells at street corners. This dual system suggests that water at night was both communal and private. Just like the cities themselves, one life inside the family walls, another pulsing through shared spaces. And there were sacred fountains, too. In Babylon, some wells were not simply utilities, but shrines. Priests drew water under strict rituals, using vessels reserved for offerings. To drink from such a source after dusk wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was about touching something divine. There are tablets describing how evening prayers were whispered as the last jars were filled, thanking the gods for allowing fresh water to rise each day from the unseen depths. A quirky tidbit. Some of these wells had carved guardians at their rims, lions, bulls, or hybrid creatures, because water was seen as a threshold between worlds, and thresholds needed guarding even more at night. But it wasn't only about spiritual care. Practical concerns demanded water be sealed and protected after dusk. Cisterns were covered with heavy lids, not only to keep things clean, but also to prevent evaporation and theft. Yes, water theft was a real worry. A neighbor sneaking out in the dark with a jug, quietly siphoning from your cistern, could leave a family short for the next day. To combat this, some households even inscribed protective symbols on their storage jars. Whether those worked by deterring thieves or just easing the owner's minds, no one can say for sure. And while water was essential for drinking and cooking, it also played a role in comfort and hygiene. Many families washed their hands and feet before lying down for the night. This wasn't just practical after walking dusty streets. Barefoot, it was ritual. To sleep unwashed was thought to invite bad dreams. In some Egyptian households, water was sprinkled lightly on the ground before bed to cool the air, releasing a dampness that made the night more bearable. Picture lying on a mat while the clay floor beneath you slowly releases a cool mist, the air smelling faintly of wet earth. At a larger scale, the city itself also managed its water carefully. The great canals of Mesopotamia, the lifelines that made fields bloom, required constant attention. At night, sluices and gates were adjusted so that irrigation wouldn't run unchecked. A single careless flow could flood a street or starve a field. So while ordinary families bolted their doors, city workers trudged through mud by torchlight, leaning into ropes and levers to redirect the waters. The city slept, but its veins kept pulsing. Even the sounds of water became part of the city's nighttime song. Wells echoing as buckets dropped, distant trickles from drains. The slosh of jars carried into kitchens, subtle reminders that life was still flowing beneath the hush. In some cities, channels ran along streets, carrying runoff toward larger drains. By night, those channels gurgled softly, like whispered conversations under the surface. You can almost imagine lying in bed and drifting off while hearing that low, constant murmur, the lullaby of infrastructure. Water was more than survival. It was imagination. Dreams of abundance and fears of drought lived side by side in every jar drawn. And so, as people covered their cisterns and sealed their wells, they weren't just protecting liquid, they were protecting hope for the morning. The city could shut its gates, silence its markets, and pen its animals. But without these quiet, nightly rituals of water, it would have had no assurance that tomorrow could begin again. By the time water jars were sealed and wells covered, the city's pulse turned toward its holiest spaces. Temples, grand or modest, loomed over ancient neighborhoods like guardians in the dusk. Just as homes and markets had their rhythms of closure, so too did the sanctuaries where gods were thought to live. If the city was going to sleep, the gods needed to be put to rest as well, or, at the very least, appeased for the long stretch of darkness. Imagine standing outside a ziggurat in Mesopotamia as the last light fades. The tiers of mud brick rise like a giant staircase into the darkening sky, torches flickering at intervals along the steps. Priests move slowly, their linen robes catching the glow. The smell of incense, sharp and resinous, drifts through the air. You hear the low murmur of chants, perhaps the final hymns of the evening. Then, one by one, the lamps set around the sanctum are snuffed out, each extinguished with careful gestures. To put out a divine lamp wasn't casual, it was symbolic, almost like tucking the deity into bed. Historians still argue whether every temple in the city followed a strict nightly ritual, or if practices varied wildly between households of priests. Some sources suggest a highly regimented schedule, offerings made at dawn and dusk, hymns sung at precise intervals, lamps lit and extinguished in strict order. Others argue the rituals were more fluid, shaped by seasons, festivals, or even the mood of the officiating priest. What we do know is that temples weren't abandoned at night. At least a few attendants always remained inside, keeping watch, ensuring that the gods' homes never stood empty. And then there were the locks. Yes, locks. Temples had doors as thick and heavy as the city gates, often bound with bronze fittings. To seal the temple at night wasn't just about security from thieves, was a declaration that the divine space was complete, inaccessible until the next sunrise. A quirky tidbit here. Some Egyptian temples featured massive door bolts that required multiple men to push into place. Imagine the echo of that timber slamming home, the sound rolling out across courtyards like thunder, announcing to everyone nearby that the god's chamber was now sealed tight. But not all fires inside were extinguished. Certain lamps or sacred flames burned continuously, believed to embody the eternal life of the god. In Babylon, for example, Marduk's temple was said to maintain an ever-burning flame, a symbol of the god's vigilance. So while many lamps were snuffed out, at least one remained, glowing through the night as a reminder that divinity never truly slept. Families living nearby would have seen that faint, steady glow above rooftops. a celestial nightlight shining from the heart of the city. In smaller shrines, the rituals were more intimate. A local neighborhood altar might see a priest's apprentice sweeping the floor, scattering grain offerings, or leaving a small dish of milk for the deity. In Egypt, priests washed and clothed statues of gods daily, and at dusk they sometimes veiled them, covering the figure until morning. The god was still present, of course, but shielded from mortal eyes during the vulnerable hours of night. It was a curious blend of care and reverence, as though divine statues themselves needed privacy to dream. And while the gods were being tended, ordinary people often made their last prayers of the day. Families paused at small clay figurines on their household shelves, murmuring requests for protection through the night. A father might ask for safe dreams for his children. A mother might whisper a plea for her grain to remain untouched by pests. These prayers weren't grand, but they were deeply human, threaded into the wider fabric of temple rituals. There's an eerie undertone to all this. Many ancient people believed that night was when demons roamed most freely, when restless spirits could slip between shadows. The temple, then, wasn't just about honoring Godzit, was about fortifying the city against whatever prowled in the darkness. Charms were hung on doorways, prayers recited at thresholds, temple gates bolted as if to keep nightmares themselves outside. And the sound of priests' final chants must have rippled through the air like a protective net, an auditory shield settling over rooftops. Some scholars even suggest that the architectural design of temples reflected this nightly closing. Heavy doors, high walls, narrow passages all. These features not only kept humans out, but may have symbolically locked in the god's presence. Once sealed, the temple became a container of divinity, glowing faintly under the stars until dawn. So the city, already quieter after the hush of markets and the stabling of animals, grew quieter still as temple courtyards emptied. The last smoke of incense curled into the sky, dissolving into the night breeze. Doors clanged shut, lamps went dark, and with each extinguished flame, the city seemed to fold further into itself. Layers of noise and activity peeled away until only the barest murmurs remained. The gods, the animals, the people all prepared now for slumber, each in their own way. The city was not lifeless, but it was cloaked, wrapped in silence and ritual, like a giant body easing into a dream. The city's gates had been bolted, the markets closed, the wells covered, the temples sealed, and the animals tethered. What followed next was a quieter, more drawn-out routine, the watch of the guards, because for all the comfort people drew from rituals of closure, there was still the lingering fact that cities did not exist in a vacuum. Enemies, thieves, fire, and accident could slip through the cracks of night. And so, when most lay down to rest, a small cadre of men remained awake, pacing walls and alleys, the guardians of sleep itself. Picture the walls of a Mesopotamian city, thick, mud-brick fortifications, lined with timber platforms, the surface hard underfoot. Along these battlements, guards patrolled slowly, their sandals making a soft thump with each step. They carried spears or bows, perhaps even short swords, depending on the wealth of the city. And always they carried staffs, heavy sticks tipped with metal caps, which they struck against the stone at intervals. The clang was deliberate, rhythmic, echoing through the night. It wasn't just a way of keeping themselves awake. It was a signal, a reminder to the citizens below. Someone was watching. Someone was keeping the darkness at bay. Historians still argue about how strictly organized these patrols were. Some records describe watches divided into shifts, announced by horns or water clocks that measured the flow of hours through the night. Others suggest the system was looser, dependent on the vigilance of commanders and the discipline of their men. Perhaps, like so many things, it varied by city and by era. But one thing is certain. The very first sense of police, of law and order after dark, was embodied in these night patrols. A quirky tidbit from ancient Athens, though much later than our earliest cities describes. Scythian archers, foreign slaves employed as public watchmen, tasked with keeping streets orderly at night. Some scholars suspect this practice echoes earlier traditions, when cities first realized that security couldn't be left to walls alone. Guards weren't just soldiers against outside attack. They were peacekeepers within, watching for fire, theft, or drunken brawls spilling from late-night feasts. The watch extended into the streets as well. Remain Babylon. Texts mention lamp-bearers, men carrying torches to light their rounds, calling out as they passed through neighborhoods. Their shouts were both reassurance and warning. You might be lying on your rooftop mat, half asleep, and hear a guard's voice carrying through the dark, deep steady, repeating the same phrase every few streets. It must have been strangely comforting, like a lullaby shouted through stone alleys, a reminder that someone else was awake so you could safely drift off. But guarding was not only about human threats. Fire, as we've noted, was a constant hazard. Watchmen carried water skins or sand-filled jars to douse sparks. Though how effective these were in real conflagrations is questionable. Still, the act of carrying them showed the awareness that vigilance mattered. Some cities even had raised watchtowers specifically for spotting fires, where men stood through the night scanning rooftops for suspicious glows. And then there were the dogs. We spoke earlier of their place as household guards, but city watchmen also relied on them, training them to pace with the patrol. Their keen ears picked up sounds that no human could hear. Their sudden barking in the stillness might send shivers through a neighborhood, a reminder that something unseen was stirring. Imagine lying in bed, hearing the staff clangs of guards fading down the street, followed suddenly by the sharp alarm of a dog. For a moment, hearts would beat faster, breath would catch until silence returned and sleep cautiously crept back. The psychological role of these patrols cannot be overstated. In cities where daily life was crowded and chaotic, where daytime authority was visible everywhere, nighttime posed a special anxiety. Without visible guards, the city might have felt like it dissolved into shadow. But the deliberate clamor of staffs, the bark of dogs, the shouts of watchmen reassured citizens that even in darkness, order still stretched its arms. It was the ancient equivalent of a streetlight glowing outside your window, a signal that you weren't entirely alone. There's debate about whether guards sometimes abused their power. Were they protectors, or were they feared themselves? Some tablets hint at complaints. Guards shaking down merchants, demanding extra rations, or even slipping away from posts to gamble or sleep. Human nature, after all, doesn't change much. The system depended on discipline, and discipline depended on leaders, and leaders weren't always perfect. Yet, despite these flaws, the system endured, because cities could not afford otherwise. The guards' patrols marked the hours of night in a way few other things did. Their staff clanks, their calls, their footsteps were a crude timepiece, dividing darkness into manageable segments. And perhaps that is why citizens came to trust them not just as protectors, but as keepers of rhythm, anchors against the formless drift of night. So, as families lay on mats, children clutching charms beneath pillows, and lamps guttered low, there was always the faint awareness of men pacing above, eyes scanning, hands ready, voices cutting through the silence. The city slept, yes, but it never slept unguarded. The watch was the bridge between day and dawn, the steady heartbeat that allowed thousands to rest in fragile confidence. By now, the guards have taken their posts along the walls, their torches flickering against mud-brick towers, their staffs striking stone at intervals like a metronome in the dark. Beyond them, the city itself is folding inward. The gates are locked, the markets cleared, the wells covered, the temples sealed, the animals tethered. One by one, households retreat into themselves, turning the maze of streets into a patchwork of silence. This was the moment when the city stopped being a machine of labor and trade, and became something softer, a collection of families, preparing to quiet their hearts for the night. Step inside a typical Mesopotamian home, and you'd see the transition. Doors of heavy wood or reed mats, reinforced with leather straps, were pulled shut and bolted. Inside, the space was dim, the last oil lamp glowing faintly in a corner. Children unrolled woven mats across the floor, smoothing them with practiced hands, while older relatives fussed over where everyone would lie. Beds, as we imagined them frames, with mattresses, were rare luxuries. For most, it was mats or rugs layered on clay floors, sometimes stuffed with reeds for a little cushion. And if you lived in Egypt, you might have a low headrest of carved wood or stone. A strange pillow by modern standards, but one that kept the neck elevated in the heat. There was always a sense of ritual in these preparations. A father might check the bolts twice before lying down, tugging on the wooden bar to hear the reassuring thud. Mothers often covered jars of grain and beer before sleep, muttering a quick protective phrase to ward off pests. Children clutched charm-steeny figurines of gods or animals, strung with thread, tucked under blankets or into fists. Archaeologists have found countless of these in ruins, simple objects worn smooth by constant touch, the ancient equivalent of a teddy bear guarding against nightmares. Historians still argue how private life really was in these early cities. Homes were often cramped with one or two main rooms shared by the entire family, servants, and sometimes even animals. Privacy as we know it barely existed. To lie down at night was to press close to the rhythms of others, the sighs of tired bodies, the creak of a mat under shifting weight, the muttered half-dreaming words of someone already drifting. And yet, within this closeness, there was safety. You weren't alone. You belonged to a unit that faced the night together. A quirky detail comes from records in the Indus Valley. Some houses had small alcoves built into walls, likely storage niches. But archaeologists speculate that at night, these niches doubled as pigeonholes for household gods or protective figurines. Imagine a family lying down while a tiny idol watched silently from a recess, a stone guardian keeping vigil until morning. It's a reminder that households didn't just shut themselves in physically. They also fortified themselves spiritually. The sounds inside a home were a lullaby of their own. The faint hiss of a lamp as its oil burned low. The rustle of mats. The drip of water from a jug sealed less carefully than the others. Beyond the walls, you could hear neighbors doing the same muffled scrape of bolts. The soft murmur of a last conversation. The hush that fell like a blanket over an entire neighborhood at once. It was less like one family going to bed, and more like a symphony winding down movement by movement. And for those who slept on rooftops, the preparations had their own flavor. In hot climates, it was common for families to climb ladders up to flat clay roofs and spread mats beneath the open sky. Up there, they caught cooler breezes, though at the cost of exposure. Doors were still locked below, but the roof became the bedroom, open to stars, to moonlight, and to the occasional intrusion of a wandering insect or bird. Some families even built small parapets to provide privacy and security, while others simply trusted that their presence among neighbors would be protection enough. This rooftop culture gave the city a peculiar nighttime look. From above, the streets might have been dark and empty, but the roofs were dotted with figures lying still, a human constellation mirroring the stars above. There, a guard pacing the wall could look inward and see families stretched out on rooftops like figures painted onto the clay. It was both intimate and communal, the city breathing in unison, exposed to the same night sky, the same drifting winds, the same faint fears of what might stir in the shadows. For those inside, the doors closed tightly against the dark. The sensation was different. Shadows pressed against the walls, thick and heavy, broken only by the dim glow of a single lamp. To be enclosed was to feel cocooned, but also to feel the thinness of the barrier between you and the outside world. A bolt of wood, a wall of brick, a door mathes were fragile protections against the immensity of night, which is perhaps why so much effort went into nightly rituals, why so many families repeated small gestures of security before lying down. And so, one by one, households dimmed their flames. Some let lamps burn until they sputtered out. Others snuffed them deliberately, preferring true darkness. A few wealthier homes might leave one flame burning through the night as a mark of status or comfort. But for the majority, sleep began in shadow, with only the faint glow of moonlight spilling through a small window or over the edges of the roof. The city hushed itself, household by household, until what remained was a steady hum of silence, broken only by the breathing of sleepers. The first cities knew the same truth we know today, that a door bolted, a mat spread, a family gathered close was the truest form of comfort. No matter how vast or complex the city was, its nighttime heart beat in these small gestures. Doors closed, lights dimmed, bodies pressed together in rest. The doors are bolted, the mats spread, and families are settling into their nightly routines. The guards pace along the walls, their staffs clanging on stone, and the last lamps flicker in scattered courtyards. What follows now is a transformation of the city's entire soundscape, a place that had been clamorous with voices, trade, animals, and hammers just hours earlier becomes something entirely different. The noise does not vanish, it shifts, softens, and thins into a tapestry of nighttime sounds. If you stood in the middle of a Mesopotamian street at noon, the air would have been alive with shouting vendors, braying donkeys, the clatter of pottery, and the endless hum of people pressing past one another. At midnight, however, the same street became a canyon of quiet. The echoes of your own footsteps would startle you. The silence had weight, pressing against your ears in a way that modern cities rarely achieve. Yet this silence was not empty, it was filled with subtle textures, faint sounds that only revealed themselves once the human clamor was gone. Dogs barked in the distance, sometimes in sharp bursts, sometimes in long, mournful howls. These weren't polite little pets. They were watchdogs and strays, their voices carrying far across mud-brick walls. To hear one dog bark was to hear another answer, until a chain of howls stitched its way across the city like a thread of warning. Then, after a pause, quiet again. Beyond the walls, frogs sang in irrigation canals. Their croaks rose and fell in rhythmic waves, echoing through fields that still shimmered with water under moonlight. Crickets added their own high-pitched chorus, a ceaseless background hum that blended with the faint rustle of reeds in the breeze. In Egypt, it might have been the sound of the Nile itself, lapping softly against its banks, carrying the occasional splash of a fish binned in the Indus Valley. Perhaps the distant rustle of palm fronds and the cry of nocturnal birds. Every city had its own chorus, tuned to its landscape, reminding its people that nature never truly slept. Historians still argue whether ordinary citizens found these nighttime sounds soothing or frightening. Some scholars suggest the noises were comforting, proof that life continued in the dark, a natural lullaby for tired ears. Others point to superstitious texts that warned of demons arriving in the voices of animals' dogs, howling as omens of death, owls calling as messengers of misfortune. The truth may be somewhere in between. The same sounds that reassured some must have unsettled others, depending on the night, the mood, and the stories told at home. A quirky detail survives in a Babylonian incantation. People believed that the croaking of frogs at night could ward off evil spirits, since demons supposedly disliked the sound. Imagine lying awake, listening to a swampy chorus of frogs, and instead of irritation, feeling relief. Croak, a tiny exorcism, each ribbit pushing back unseen forces of the dark. But it wasn't only animals that made up the nocturnal song. The city itself made noises as it rested. Clay walls creaked as they cooled, releasing the heat of the day. Roofs sometimes cracked softly, the sound of drying mud contracting in the cooler air. Wooden beams groaned faintly, shifting under their own weight. For people used to these sounds, they were background murmurs of reassurance, the house breathing with them. But for children, those same creaks could sound like footsteps of unseen intruders, sparking a whole cascade of whispered fears. And then there were the voices of humans themselves, carried further at night when the air was still. A cough in a neighboring courtyard, a lullaby sung in a low voice, a last whispered conversation between lovers lying on a rooftop. These small human sounds echoed across sleeping neighborhoods, weaving intimacy into the vast quiet. If you lived in one of these early cities, you might hear your neighbor's words more clearly at midnight than at midday, when the world's roar drowned everything else out. Every now and then, something louder pierced the calm. A guard's shout from the wall, announcing the change of watch. The sudden clatter of a jar knocked over by a stray dog. The bray of a donkey, sharp enough to wake a baby. But these were exceptions, momentary disruptions. For the most part, the city settled into a rhythm of softer, slower noise. It wasn't silence as we might imagine it in a desert or a forest. It was silence shaped by living things, a hush that breathed, shifted, and pulsed just below the threshold of awareness. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of white noise, binned, instead of the hum of an air conditioner or the soft drone of a fan. People fell asleep to dogs, frogs, insects, and the occasional human murmur. The city itself created a blanket of sound that wrapped its inhabitants, sometimes soothing, sometimes unsettling, but always present. To sleep in those first cities was to surrender to a soundscape not controlled by humans, but by the collaboration of creatures, buildings, and night air. And so, as families lay down and lamps sputtered out, they listened. Some drifted quickly into dreams, lulled by the rhythms of frogs and the breathing of neighbors. Butters lay awake, attuned to every bark, every creak, every rustle, waiting for the reassurance that the city would hold through the night. The first cities slept, yes, but their dreams were woven with sound. By now, the soundscape has thinned into its nighttime humdogs, barking in the distance, frogs croaking in the canals, and the occasional clang of a guard's staff on stones. For many families, the heat inside clay-walled houses made true rest difficult, so the rooftops became the city's largest communal bedroom. Imagine climbing a narrow ladder as the air finally begins to cool, carrying a rolled mat under your arm, stepping up into the openness of a moonlit roof. This was not just a choice. In much of the ancient world, it was survival. Flat roofs were the quiet saviors of early cities, built from clay plaster spread over beams of palm wood or reeds. They were sturdy enough to hold an entire family lying side by side. The day's sun would have baked them hot, but by midnight the stored heat began to radiate into the sky, leaving a faint warmth beneath the skin as breezes drifted over the surface. Lying there, you were not shut inside thick walls, but under an endless dome of stars. You might hear neighbors shifting on their own rooftops, their silhouettes visible in the dim light, but the distance felt safe rather than intrusive, and intimacy without conversation. Children loved these nights most of all. Freed from the stuffiness of indoor rooms, they would point upward at the sky, tracing patterns into constellations they barely understood. "That one is the bull," a father might whisper, gesturing toward the cluster of stars we know as Taurus. "And that one is the hunter," someone else would say, pointing to Orion, his belt sharp and bright, even in the haze of city smoke. Historians still argue how much formal astronomy filtered down into the lives of ordinary citizens. But myths and patterns were certainly familiar. To sleep under the sky was also to sleep under stories written in light. And the moon, the moon. Its glow mattered deeply to the rhythms of rooftop sleep. On nights of the full moon, the city glowed faintly silver. Shadows cast sharp across walls and alleyways. Families might whisper longer under this light, reluctant to surrender to dreams when the world seemed awake with brightness. On moonless nights, the sky was so black that it pressed heavy against the face, the stars sharp and countless. In that kind of darkness, children sometimes clutched charms tighter, and adults whispered more prayers, the absence of the moon reminding them how thin the veil of safety really was. A quirky tidbit from cuneiform tablets. People believed sleeping under the stars could invite prophetic dreams. The gods, it was said, wandered the heavens at night, and lying exposed meant you were more open to their whispers. Whether that belief gave people comfort or unease is hard to say, but it certainly added a mystical shimmer to the act of rooftop slumber. What for us might be a simple relief from heat was for them also a brush with the divine. The social rhythm of rooftops was fascinating too. You might not speak to your neighbors all day, but at night, lying silently across narrow alleys, you could hear them breathe, cough, shift in their sleep. Sometimes hushed conversations drifted from roof to roof, carried softly in the breeze. A mother soothing a baby, a grandfather telling one last story, a pair of young lovers exchanging whispered words when the rest of their household had gone still. The rooftops were private, yes, but they were also part of a city-wide web of intimacy, voices weaving lightly across the dark. Of course, sleeping outdoors came with risks. Mosquitoes swarmed, especially near canals or rivers. Insects crawled across mats. Birds might swoop or cry out, startled by shadows. And yet, for all the discomfort, the rooftop was worth it. To sleep inside was to sweat in stagnant heat. To sleep outside was to drift in cooler air, lulled by wind and starlight. Families accepted the trade, layering mats with reed coverings, tucking themselves into the night as best they could. Some cities even designed their homes around this practice. In your staircases led directly to rooftops, evidence of how integral these spaces were to daily life. Roofs weren't just bedrooms. They were gathering spots, storage areas, even workspaces. But at night, they transformed into platforms of dreams. Imagine thousands of people lying quietly, side by side, the entire city elevated into the sky. From the walls, a guard might glance inward and see a patchwork of sleeping figures, a city mirroring the constellations above. And then came the breezes. The desert nights could be brutal, sometimes icy, sometimes warm, but the breezes were always a blessing. They carried scents from fields outside the walls, damp earth, hay, the faint sweetness of crops. They carried the smells of the city too: smoke, animals, cooking fires gone cold. To lie under those breezes was to breathe in both safety and danger, civilization and wilderness, human and divine. The first cities did not have air conditioners or fans. They had rooftops. They had moonlight, stars, and wind. And for thousands of people, those were enough. The act of climbing up into the night, of lying shoulder to shoulder under the heavens, was itself a ritual of trust. Trust that the gods would watch from the sky. Trust that the guards would watch from the walls. Trust that the neighbors would sleep, not steal. And in that trust, the city itself exhaled, turning its roofs into one vast bedspread stretched under the stars. The rooftops are full of families now, stretched on mats, whispering under the stars. The alleys have fallen quiet, punctuated only by the creak of wooden beams, or the occasional bark of a dog. But not everyone in the first cities simply closed their eyes and drifted into sleep. Night was also a time of secret moments, of whispered words, stolen meetings, hushed exchanges that could not risk the scrutiny of daylight. While the city rested, pockets of human drama unfolded in the shadows. Picture a young scribe lingering in his courtyard. Long after his family has gone to bed, he's lit a single lamp, shielding it with his hand, so the glow doesn't betray him to neighbors. On a clay tablet, he scratches lines of cuneiform, copying a story or practicing accounts. He shouldn't be awake, this late toil is expensive, and his father has scolded him before, but he can't resist. By morning, the tablet will be tucked away, and no one will know he spent half the night bent over the signs. Scholars still debate how common literacy was among ordinary citizens, but for those who could write, the pull of practice was irresistible. The glow of a hidden lamp might tell its own story, not of theft or romance, but of quiet ambition. Elsewhere, another lamp burns for more dangerous reasons. Lovers meet in shadowed courtyards, whispering to each other in low tones, pressed close to the walls. In a city where marriages were arranged, where dowries and contracts determined unions, passion often had to slip into the night like a thief. Rooftop to rooftop, two figures might crawl closer, whispering across the gap, then retreating quickly at the sound of a dog's bark. A quirky tidbit comes from old Babylonian love poetry, which describes women sneaking out when the city sleeps to meet their beloved. These verses remind us that behind the stone and order of early cities, hearts still leaped recklessly into the dark. But not all nighttime whispers were tender. Some were sharp, hurried, full of tension. Small conspiracies might have been hatched after midnight. Neighbors venting about taxes. Merchants plotting how to smuggle goods past the watch. Or families scheming to resolve disputes. The very fact that the city enforced order so tightly during the day meant that grievances often spilled into the margins of night. The risk was higher, patrols were listening, and informants were real but still. People whispered because secrecy demanded shadows. Historians still argue about the extent of criminal activity in these early hours. Were thieves brazen enough to move through alleys while watchmen patrolled? Some argue yes, pointing to tablets, recording thefts of grain, oil, and animals. Others argue no, claiming that night watch was strict and punishments severe enough to discourage most crime. The truth is likely messy. A clever thief could always find a way slipping through a drainage channel, scaling a wall, bribing a sleepy guard. And if he succeeded, his crime might remain hidden until morning, when someone woke to find a jar missing or a tether cut loose. Not every secret, though, was scandalous. Some were simply human. A mother rocking a restless child in the dark murmured a lullaby soft enough that only her family heard. A father, sitting outside on a stool, smoked a small pipe of herbs, lost in thought about debts or dreams. A pair of teenagers, supposed to be sleeping, whispered jokes back and forth until their giggles risked waking the household. The night gave cover for small rebellions and private joys, the kind of things daytime's busy eyes would not permit. And yet, the risk of being caught was always present. A lamp burning too brightly, a voice carrying too far, the sound of footsteps in the alley could draw suspicion. Neighbors were watchful, not always out of malice, but out of habit. A sudden cry of "Who goes there?" from a rooftop could freeze a lover mid-step, send a thief darting back into shadow, or silence a whispered conversation instantly. Cities slept, but never entirely. There is a curious record from Egypt, describing how families occasionally left food outside their doors at night, not for neighbors, but for the wandering spirits of the dead. These offerings, small bowls of beer or bread, were meant to pacify ghosts so they wouldn't trouble sleepers. But imagine the temptation for a hungry thief. A quick snatch of bread from someone's doorstep could easily be disguised as the spirits must have taken it. The line between sacred ritual and secret theft blurred easily in the shadows. The secrets of night, then, were layered. Some were tender, some reckless, some fearful. The city might have seemed to sleep when viewed from the walls, but within its alleys and courtyards, human life still flickered quietly. Dreams weren't the only things unfolding in darkness. There were ambitions being written in clay, kisses being stolen, coins being pocketed, lullabies being hummed. The first cities did not entirely rest. They carried on in whispers, in shadows, in secrets stitched into the fabric of the night. Secrets whispered under lamps and rooftops eventually gave way to the larger truth that lay heavy over every ancient city. Night was not simply quiet, was dangerous. The setting of the sun pulled open a curtain behind which countless fears lurked. For people living in your Mohenjo-daro Memphis or Thebes, darkness was not just the absence of light, it was the presence of uncertainty. And with uncertainty came dread. First and foremost were the fears of the supernatural. Ancient texts are littered with references to spirits, demons, and restless gods who wandered in the night. In Mesopotamian incantations, night demons, known as Utuku or Lilichu, were believed to slip through windows, feeding on human breath. Egyptian belief described the hours after dusk as a dangerous passage when the sun god Ra battled serpents in the underworld. His victory never guaranteed until dawn. To sleep, then, was not only to rest it, was to trust that the gods would win their battles before morning. Historians still argue whether ordinary people took these myths literally or symbolically. But either way, they show how night was imagined as a battlefield beyond human sight. Families guarded against these unseen threats in countless ways. Charms were placed beneath pillows, doorways were painted with protective symbols, and prayers were recited softly before lamps were extinguished. Some even tied amulets to children's wrists or hung figurines of fierce gods like Pazuzu in corners to scare away malevolent forces. A quirky tidbit: clay figurines of demons themselves were sometimes buried under thresholds, not to invite them in, but to trick them into being trapped like catching a mosquito in a jar. It was a world where protection meant surrounding yourself with as much spiritual armor as possible, especially when your body was most vulnerable, asleep and unaware. But fears weren't only supernatural. The darkness made every ordinary danger sharper. Thieves could move unseen, scaling low walls or slipping through alleys. Families worried about waking to find grain jars lighter, animals untethered, or even doors forced open. Watchmen patrolled, but no system was perfect, and suspicion lingered in the silence. A bray of a donkey in the night might mean nothing, or it might mean someone was trying to lead it quietly away. Wild animals also prowled. Outside the walls, jackals howled, and their cries echoed through the night like eerie laughter. In some cities, hyenas or lions were not unheard of, stalking fields near the edges of human habitation. Inside the walls, packs of stray dogs could be just as frightening, their fights in alleys, breaking the silence with snarls and yelps. For a child lying awake on a rooftop, these sounds must have been magnified into nightmares, every bark a possible monster, every howl a sign of doom. And then, of course, there was fire. A single overturned lamp, an ember falling onto straw, could ignite a blaze that raced through clay brick alleys faster than anyone could respond. Families lived with the awareness that night fires were among the greatest terrors. For once flames took hold, few could escape their speed. Some historians suggest that this fear-shaped nightly rituals lamps snuffed out deliberately, embers buried carefully in ash, jars of water kept near doorways just in case. Fire patrols tried to keep watch, but for many households, it was only habit and luck that kept disaster away. Even nature itself added unease. Without artificial light, the night sky could overwhelm. The stars were bright, beautiful, and infinite, but their sheer immensity reminded people of their fragility. A sudden eclipse of the moon, rare but dramatic, could throw entire communities into panic. To see the moon vanish was to see the city's nightlight extinguished, a cosmic omen that something terrible was coming. Priests scrambled to interpret, offering sacrifices or chants to reassure terrified citizens. The night, already heavy with fear, became unbearable on such occasions. For all these reasons, many people avoided leaving their homes after dusk. To step outside was to risk too much. Spirits, thieves, animals, fire, omens. Night was not for wandering. It was for staying put. And so, once doors were bolted and mats unrolled, the city became a place of quiet stillness, punctuated only by its necessary watchmen, and the rare soul, braver, foolish enough to creep through its shadows. And yet, fear itself became part of the city's rhythm. It shaped how people lived, how they prayed, how they trusted one another. To go to sleep was to surrender, knowing you could not control what happened outside your door, only prepare for it. The first cities lived with that tension constantly. That civilization could build walls and gates, but it could not banish the dangers of night. So families clung closer, whispered more prayers, checked locks one last time, and as they drifted into dreams, the city lay wrapped in its own anxieties, holding its breath until dawn's first light pierced the shadows and proved, once again, that the world had survived the long, uncertain hours of darkness. With the city shrouded in its anxiety spirits prowling in the imagination, thieves whispered about in alleys, the howl of jackals echoing off the walls. Families turned inward to their final defense of the night, dreams. To sleep was not simply to shut your eyes. It was to step into a realm thought to be threaded with omens, warnings, and blessings. And so the rituals surrounding dreams became as important as any bolt on a door or guard on a wall. Picture a small, clay-walled room in Babylon. A mother tucks her children onto mats, and before she lets them drift off, she mutters a soft prayer. Her hands hover briefly above their foreheads as she calls upon a protective deity to guard their dreams. At their heads, she places a tiny amulet, a carved bead, a miniature figurine, or even a knotted cord. To us, these might seem like trinkets. To them, they were shields against the invisible world. Archaeologists have found countless such charms buried in households, tucked under thresholds or beneath sleeping spaces. They were meant to keep away nightmare demons, those beings thought to slip into dreams and twist them into terrors. Historians still argue whether dreams were seen primarily as divine messages or as random wanderings of the mind. Some texts suggest that every dream carried meaning omens of harvests, floods, wars, or births. Others imply that people knew dreams could also be nonsense, requiring priests or diviners to sort the prophetic from the foolish. In either case, dreams were not dismissed. They were consulted, recorded, and sometimes feared more than waking events. In Mesopotamia, Dream interpreters were professionals. Whole collections of clay tablets survive with lists of if you dream of this. It means that, for instance, to dream of eating dates might mean prosperity was coming, while to dream of falling meant misfortune. A quirky tidbit. One tablet bluntly declared that dreaming of a pig meant you would soon get into a fight with your wife. Imagine waking up recounting your dream to a priest and being told that marital strife was inevitable because of what you'd seen in sleep. Dreams weren't private musings, they were social currency, woven into how people planned their lives. Egypt took dreams seriously too. Temples sometimes kept sleeping chambers where people would lie overnight, hoping for divine visions. Priests claimed that gods like Serapis or Thoth might send messages to the faithful as they slept on temple floors. By the practice, known later as incubation, turned sleep into a ritual pilgrimage. You didn't just rest, you sought an answer, and whatever you dreamed could be written down and interpreted, shaping your choices in daylight. Even in ordinary homes, dreams were surrounded by ritual. People might place bowls of herbs or drops of oil near their beds, believing certain scents would invite peaceful visions. Others tied protective knots into their bedding or sprinkled water on the floor before sleeping. Symbolic gestures meant to wash away bad spirits before they could approach. Parents sang lullabies that doubled as spells, repeating phrases that not only soothed children, but also promised them gentle, untroubled dreams. And of course, dreams were stories. In the close quarters of a household, morning often began with someone recounting what they had seen in the night. A child boasting that he had ridden a lion. A woman worriedly recalling that her jar of grain spilled over in her dream. A man insisting that he saw the city's walls crumble in his sleep. These stories were debated, joked about, or taken to priests for interpretation. Night did not just pass in darkness. Sit produced tales that spilled into morning, adding to the shared fabric of the city. Some dreams were dreaded more than others. Falling, drowning, teeth-breaking, these were considered ominous almost everywhere. But flying, feasting, or seeing clear water were often read as signs of blessing. The line between fear and hope was drawn in images, and people listened closely. Because in a world where crops, floods, and wars were unpredictable, any hint of knowledge event from sleep was seized upon. And so, as the night deepened, the city slept under a web of dreams. On rooftops, under stars, children whispered to one another about what they hoped to see when they closed their eyes. In temples, pilgrims lay waiting for visions from gods. In cramped rooms, families trusted their amulets and charms to guard them from nightmare demons. The first cities didn't simply rest. They stepped into a parallel world, one that was believed to hold as much truth as waking life. The city was silent, yes, but inside every sleeper's mind, stories unfolded, prophecies, fears, desires, and by morning those stories would mingle with clay tablets, temple rituals, and family chatter, weaving the invisible world of dreams into the tangible rhythm of life. The night stretches on, filled with the soft murmurs of dreams and the occasional call of a watchman. Slowly, though the weight of darkness begins to lift. The stars still shine. The moon may still hang pale above the rooftops, but the city stirs in small, quiet ways, long before the sun shows its face. Dawn, for the first cities, was not a sudden explosion of activity. It was a gradual shift, a gentle swelling of sound and motion as people prepared for the day to return. The first to rise were often the bakers. Archaeologists working in ancient Mesopotamian sites have uncovered rows of ovens built into courtyards, their clay mouths blackened from centuries of fire. To bake bread for an entire city was no small task. By the time most families were still curled on mats, the bakers were already crouched by their ovens, coaxing flames back to life from carefully banked embers left overnight. The smell of baking flatbread drifted through narrow streets, a signal as reliable as any rooster crow. For many, that aroma was the city's true alarm clock. And then there were the animals. Restless donkeys stamped their hooves against packed earth, impatient for feeding. Goats bleated insistently in their pens. Chickens flapped and scratched, releasing a racket of cackles that broke the night's quiet. These sounds carried easily across the rooftops, tugging people gently out of slumber. It's easy to imagine a child stirring on a mat, eyes still closed, murmuring in annoyance at the bray of a donkey that insisted the morning had already begun. Water to announce the coming day. Buckets thudded as they were lowered back into wells. Ropes creaked against pulleys, and the first splashes echoed up from dark cisterns. Families needed water for bread dough, for washing faces and hands, for refreshing animals. And so, as dawn crept closer, the wells once again became busy nodes of life. Historians still argue whether the first draws of water were considered purer, more blessed than those taken later in the day. Some texts hint at morning libations, pouring the first sip of water back to the gods before drinking the rest. It's a reminder that for these people, even ordinary chores were framed in ritual. The streets themselves began to murmur. A door creaked open, followed by the shuffle of feet carrying baskets. A merchant moved quietly, arranging goods before the market bell or horn called the official opening. In some places, horns were indeed blown at dawn sharp, brassy notes that echoed over the rooftops, summoning people to rise and return to their work. Imagine that sound cutting through the lingering hush, both jarring and reassuring, a declaration that the night had ended and order had returned. A quirky tidbit. In certain Egyptian towns, the very first duty of temple staff at dawn was to wake the god. Priests would remove veils from statues, light lamps anew, and sing hymns to announce morning. To them, dawn wasn't just for humans, it was for gods too. The ritual acted as a cosmic parallel to families shaking children awake, nudging them from sleep into the daily grind. Everyone, divine and mortal alike, needed reminding that the day had begun. And for those who slept on rooftops, dawn was a more visible spectacle. The eastern sky shifted from black to deep purple to red, the horizon glowing over fields beyond the walls. Families stirred, rolling mats, brushing dust from their hair, rubbing sleep from their eyes as the world slowly lit. Birds filled the air with chatter, swooping low over roofs in search of crumbs. Even before the sun itself appeared, its approach was undeniable. Historians still debate how time was kept before sundials and water clocks became widespread. But one thing is certain: dawn was the most reliable marker of all. The animals knew it, the bakers knew it, the priests knew it. The city, which had folded itself tightly into darkness, unfolded again with the first light. And that unfolding was not chaotic. It was patterned, practiced, repeated countless times, until it became as much a part of life as breathing. Think of the quiet shift as households stirred, the sound of mats being rolled, jars being uncovered, small fires being blown back to life with soft huffs of breath. These were domestic sounds, intimate and ordinary, but multiplied across thousands of households. They gave the city its gentle morning rhythm. A family in one alley might already be grinding grain, while another just stretched awake. A child laughed, chasing a chicken across a roof. Somewhere a pot clattered. These were the signals of renewal, the proof that the city had endured the night and was beginning again. And so, as the sky lightened and the horizon blushed, the city prepared itself not only for survival, but for continuity. Every dawn was a quiet victory, a reassurance that the world had held together through hours when it seemed most fragile. In that way, the rising of the sun was more than light. It was the city's deepest sigh of relief. The eastern horizon begins to glow brighter now, and what was once only the stirrings of bakers, animals, and priests swells into a full awakening. The city, which had folded itself in upon dusk like a flower closing, now stretches its petals wide again. After long hours of guarded silence and anxious dreams, morning asserts itself with certainty. The gates, once sealed against the world, are the final and most dramatic sign that the night has ended. Picture the gatekeepers at their posts, yawning, stretching stiff arms after a long night of listening to the muffled city breathe behind them. The heavy beams are slid back with a grinding scrape. The bronze fittings clatter as they're lifted free. Then, with effort and groans of timber, the massive wooden doors creak open. The sound is both mechanical and ceremonial, like a ritual chant. Inside, families hear it and know the night has passed. The city is open again. Historians still argue whether this daily opening was marked with horns, drums, or bells. In some accounts from later cities, a horn blast did indeed announce the new day. In others, the visual act alone, the doors swinging open, guards waving weary hands, was enough. Either way, the symbolism was immense. Just as closing the gates at dusk had meant sealing safety, opening them at dawn meant renewal, confidence, and readiness. The world outside, with its fields, canals, and roads, became part of the city once more. Merchants were often among the first to gather, lining up with carts of goods. Farmers trudged in from fields, their donkeys loaded with sacks of grain or bundles of reeds. Travelers who had camped outside the walls all night hurried through, grateful to leave behind the dangers of exposure. To pass through a gate at dawn was to cross not only a boundary of stone, but the boundary between fear and safety, between night and day. Inside the walls, households mirrored this activity. Doors creaked open, releasing smells of baking bread and smoke from rekindled fires. Women carried jars of water to rooftops for washing. Men loaded tools onto carts. Children stretched, rubbed their eyes, and immediately began chasing one another between alleys, as though night's hush had never existed. The city's heartbeat quickened, pulsing through narrow lanes like blood through veins. A quirky detail from yore. Some clay tablets describe offerings left at the gates, each morning bread, dates, or small bowls of beerment to thank protective deities for keeping the city safe through the night. Imagine the sight. Bowls lined along the threshold, steam rising faintly from freshly baked loaves. A quiet exchange between human hands and divine guardians. It was as though the gates themselves needed breakfast before they could properly begin their day. The rooftops, too, transformed. Mats were rolled and stacked, ash was swept from corners. Children pointed one last time at fading stars before the brightness swallowed them. The moon, pale and retiring, slipped behind the western edge, and in its absence, the sun's light took possession of the sky. Birds burst into noisy chatter, swooping low as though impatient for crumbs from breakfast bread. The city's quiet constellation of sleepers dissolved into a busy hive once more. For all its size and complexity, the city was nothing without this cycle. To sleep together was to survive the night. To wake together was to reaffirm the promise of continuity. Night had been dangerous, uncertain, threaded with whispers of spirits and fears of fire. But dawn proved resilience. Gates opened, animals brayed, priests sang hymns, bakers shouted for customers, and the citizens of the first cities took up their tools again. Historians still debate whether this rhythm made people feel more secure or more trapped-bound into a cycle they could never escape. But perhaps both were true. Safety came in repetition. The predictability of night closing and morning opening was its own comfort, even if it also meant the days blurred into one another endlessly. And so the first cities awoke. They rose from their mats, gathered their animals, opened their doors, and stepped into another day, just as dusk had drawn them together in silence and fear. Dawn now pushed them outward in noise and energy. The city lived again, reborn in the light, ready to repeat the dance of closing and opening, guarding and dreaming, each and every day until the end of its story. And now, as we leave the first cities to their morning bustle, you can let yourself sink deeper into rest. The story has moved from dusk to dawn, from gates shutting tight to gates opening wide. And in that rhythm, you've walked alongside thousands of years of human routine. Picture it now, softer, quieter, the glow of lamps dimming, the hush of markets, the settling of animals, the watchman's staff echoing faintly in the night. These images, once vivid, can blur gently in your mind, fading like footprints in sand as the tide comes in. Imagine lying on a rooftop, the clay still warm beneath you, a breeze brushing softly across your skin. Around you, families breathe steadily, their mats spread like patches of cloth under the sky. Above, stars shimmer faintly, their light timeless and calm. The fears of night spirits, thieves, distant howls grow, distant now, shrinking into the background until they are only whispers. What remains is stillness, the kind of stillness that wraps you like a blanket. You can feel the rhythm of the ancient city merging with your own. The gates closing, your eyelids heavy, the lamps dimming, your thoughts quieting, the animals stilled, your body easing deeper into comfort. Even the dawn preparations, the bakers stirring, the water drawn can be softened in your imagination, stretched out until they become slow, lulling movements that carry you further into calm. Let the city drift away now. Its walls fade, its voices blur, its rooftops dissolve into clouds. You are left with only breath, steady and unhurried, carrying you into a place where time no longer matters, safe, secure, cocooned in the silence of night. Rest now and dream gently.